In years gone by, this would be the typical backdrop for your humble ute. The Toyota Hilux in particular has become synonymous with job sites around the country in its role as a tool of trade. And now the 8th generation model has landed and it has an even bigger role to play, with families looking to use it as their tool of trade. So can it strike up the perfect work-life balance? The Hilux has undergone significant change in a bid to appeal to a wider section of the general public, from city slickers to the adventurous. There are new engines, revised underpinnings and fresh styling. The changes have also extended to the interior, where you have a much more thought out driver positioning with reach adjustment on the steering wheel and even soft bolstering in the sides of the seats. In addition, there's a new digital instrument cluster in this main display here, as well as a 6.1-inch touchscreen. Thankfully though, one thing that Toyota hasn't changed are these nifty cup holders in front of the air vents. They keep your drinks cool in summer and warm in winter. It's a similar story in the rear seat, though the changes aren't quite as extensive. The rear seat is still quite upright and you don't get rear air vents, but there is airbag coverage for all occupants and the seats themselves are quite soft.
There is only one child seat restraint point to attach to across the rear bench, and the ergonomics lack finesse, with a touchscreen which reflects directly into the rear window and back into the driver's face at night, along with materials which shine directly onto the driver's face during the day. Now, the old Hilux was easily the best-selling vehicle in its class during its lifespan, but you could argue that towards the end, perhaps it wasn't all that deserving of the success. I mean, the engine, the 3-litre turbo diesel engine, was quite agricultural. It was well down on its competitors in its towing and payload abilities, and it wasn't all that comfortable. It basically did the basics, but not much else. Well, happily, Toyota has addressed a lot of those shortfalls with the updated model. It feels immediately more comfortable inside the cabin. It's quieter, the engine is much more refined, and even things like the driving position, it's way more like an SUV in the way that it drives and also in the way that you sit in the car compared with before. Now, from the outset, you do notice some differences in the steering, ride and handling characteristics. The steering itself is much more sharper and responsive than what it was. You get a lot more feedback through the wheel than before, and there's not that sloppiness that you sort of associate with most dual cab utes, especially on centre. It's a similar story in the handling. The body control is a lot more tighter, so you go through a corner, there's less roll, the car sits in and gives back a lot more response to the driver and just sort of builds a confidence that the old car couldn't really do. At the heart of the Hilux is a range of 4 different engines, 2 petrol and 2 diesel. The flagship powertrain is the new 2.8-litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel driven here. Its power has been increased from the predecessor to 130 kilowatts and 450 newton meters. The most notable improvement has to be the engine. It's been downsized from 3 litres down to 2.8 litres, but that hasn't detracted from performance in any way. The outputs themselves are still down on the main competitors, such as the Ford Ranger, but out on the road, it doesn't really feel like it's lacking for anything. It picks up nicely, it's smooth through the whole rev range, and there's new gearboxes, a new 6-speed manual that we're driving here, as well as the optional 6-speed automatic, which is an additional $2,000. The manual itself is much more smoother. You've still got quite a long throw, but it's a lot more smoother. You haven't got that same sort of agricultural feel when you're changing gears, so a huge improvement there. With regards to economy, the 2.8-litre diesel engine will get you about between 9 and 10 litres per 100 out on the open road, so not quite down there with the claim, but pretty close. The engine as well is less laggy than before. You get more pickup down low and more usable power, which is important. And with the transmission helping out as well, you can be sitting on about 2,000 RPM doing 110 kilometres an hour. So it's way less stress on the engine, and as a result, you get better fuel economy. Along with the engines, the Hilux's underpinnings have been tweaked, including a reworked double wishbone front suspension and leaf spring rear, which have been made more cosseting despite an increase in payload and towing capacity to 1,030 kilograms and 3.5 tonnes on the model we're driving. Those attributes help make this car a lot more friendly with families. Put on top of that the fact that it's much quieter inside the cabin and you're not being sort of belted around over little bumps as you were before, and it definitely has better credentials in that regard. With bumps, it is a lot more cosseting over bumps than what it was. You've still got that initial firmness over small undulations, but it settles really quickly and you don't get whipped around, as I say, as you would find in previous Hiluxes. Now, Toyota's research sort of suggests that the average bike will carry a couple hundred kilos in the back at all times. I think if you were to do that, it would settle the ride noticeably, but even unladen, this thing is quite smooth and easily livable for everyday driving. While it does lean fairly strongly to its workhorse origins, the updated Hilux is definitely more appealing to families. The 8th generation model finally lives up to the hype. The bigger test now is whether it can live up to the competition.